Bartolomé Gutierrez was born in Mexico City in 1580. When he was 17, he entered holy orders in the Augustinian monastery there. In 1612, he was sent as a missionary to Japan by way of the Philippines. After only 2 years in Japan, he was exiled as the persecution of Christians worsened, but he chose to return 4 years later. He spent 15 years in Japan in the midst of a bloody persecution. In 1629, Gutierrez and another Augustinian brother, a native Japanese, were arrested. After 2 years in prison, they and 6 others, including 2 women, were tortured by being scalded alive in hot sulfur springs for a month. On September 3, 1632, they were taken to the Hill of Martyrs in Nagasaki and burned alive. Their ashes were thrown into the ocean. And now, let's discover the story behind the saint. The name of the country is Nippon, which means origin of the sun, because the sun rises over their islands before shining on the Asian mainland to the west. Japan is only about 100 miles from the Asian mainland, but it has always been defined by its relationship to the sea, and through much of its history, the oceans around it fostered an isolated and inward-looking culture. Christianity arrived in Japan in 1549, brought by the Portuguese missionary priest Saint Francis Xavier, co-founder of the Jesuit order. It was a long journey for Father Xavier and the Portuguese Jesuits, literally to the ends of the earth. The Portuguese route to Japan went from Lisbon, south around the Horn of Africa to Mozambique, on to Goa in India, through the Malacca Straits, to the Portuguese trading base in Macau near modern Hong Kong. From there, they made their way to Kyushu, the southern island of Japan. When St. Francis Xavier and the Portuguese Jesuits arrived, they found a field ripe for harvest. Catholicism blossomed on Kyushu, the most southwesterly of Japan's home islands, and particularly around Nagasaki, the main harbor that interacted with the Asian mainland. After 50 years, only a few generations, there were an estimated 300,000 or more practicing Catholics in Japan. Hundreds of churches had been built throughout the country, not just on Kyushu, but as far as the north end of Honshu Island. The church included Japanese from every social level, from peasants to samurai feudal lords. Half the Jesuits and other religious brothers at this time were Japanese natives. Nagasaki became known as the Rome of the Far East, the Catholic capital of East Asia. Most of its inhabitants were Christians. It was divided into 8 parishes with 10 churches, including one for Korean immigrants. The church there was sending missionaries to Korea. There were Catholic schools and hospitals, including one for lepers. There were Catholic monasteries and convents. There was even a printing press, producing thousands of Catholic books in the Japanese language. By the end of the 16th century, the Buddhist and Shinto religions had essentially been replaced by Catholicism around Nagasaki. But this flourishing Catholic culture worried the shoguns, the military rulers of Japan. They became increasingly concerned about foreign colonial influences. So, in 1587, they banned the Portuguese Jesuits from entering the country, and 26 Jesuits and Franciscans, 17 of whom were native Japanese, were martyred in Nagasaki. They were crucified and then pierced with spears in mockery of Christ's own death. The 26 martyrs of Nagasaki were canonized in 1862 and are also known as St. Paul Mikian Companions. We have an episode planned for February to tell their story. With the Jesuits banned from entry, it fell to other religious orders to continue the missionary work in Japan. The Dominicans and Franciscans sent friars and priests, and so did the Augustinians. The Augustinians took their name from Saint Augustine, the towering father of the early church, who was Bishop of Hippo in what is now Algeria. Augustine's missionary vision was compelling, and during the Middle Ages a group of monks in Tuscany gained permission from the Pope to form the Augustinian order. Perhaps the most famous Augustinian monk lived in Wittenberg, Germany, where he nailed his complaints to the cathedral door in 1517 to start the Protestant Reformation. His name was Martin Luther. The Augustinian order spread to the New World with a presence in Mexico City. And there, in 1597, only 75 years after the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, and 65 years after the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to St. Juan Diego as Our Lady of Guadalupe, a 17-year-old Bartholomew Gutierrez took vows in the Augustinian order in Mexico City. After only a few years in the monastery there, he was sent to the Philippines, to Manila, which we'll visit later again in the final segment of this episode. After a few years there, in 1612, he was sent to Japan to be the prior of the Augustinian monastery in Usuki, not far from Nagasaki. The situation in Japan was changing rapidly. The military ruler of Japan was called the shogun. His feudal lords were called daimyos, and they had retinues of armed warriors, the samurai. And in 1603, after a civil war, the leader of the Tokugawa clan became shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate was determined to drive foreign influence from the home islands, and that meant extinguishing Catholicism. When Father Gutierrez entered Japan in 1612, the persecution of Christians was well underway. But only 2 years after he arrived, the shogun ordered all the missionaries expelled from the country and all the churches to be destroyed, and he was exiled back to the Philippines. Year by year after 1614, the number of martyrdoms grew. 55, 15, 25, 62, 88. The Japanese church meticulously recorded their heroic witness with their Japanese name, Christian name, and place of execution. Father Gutierrez had been exiled back to the Philippines in 1614, but it was in the midst of this persecution that he chose to return to Japan 4 years later to minister to these dear brothers and sisters who were making the ultimate sacrifice for their faith. In Nagasaki, on the 10th of September 1622, 9 Jesuits, 6 Dominicans, 4 Franciscans, and 6 lay Christians were put to death at the stake after witnessing the beheading of about 30 other Japanese lay Catholics. From December until the end of September 1624, there were 285 martyrs. The conviction of these followers of Christ is hard for us to imagine in the comfort of our time. An English sea captain, Richard Cox, who was in Japan at the time, reported back to the British government that he, quote, saw 55 martyred at Miyako at one time, and among them little children 5 or 6 years old, burned in their mother's arms, crying out, "Jesus, receive our souls." Many more are in prison who look hourly when they shall die, for very few will turn to paganism, even under sentence of death. With Catholicism so entrenched in Japan, how could the rulers stamp it out? To sort out the faithful from the marginally committed cultural Christians, to separate the sheep from the goats, the wheat from the weeds. In 1629, the government introduced the practice of fumie. Fumie is the Japanese word for foot or step, and yi is the word for picture or image, so the term literally meant stepping on an image or stepping on a picture. To ferret out who the true Catholics were, the shoguns came up with a diabolically clever test. It's just a bit of bronze on a couple of sticks. It should mean nothing to you. So go ahead. Step on it. And you won't have to watch your family tortured to death before your eyes. At first, they used crucifixes, or paper pictures of Jesus or Mary. But with so many Catholics spread throughout the country, they needed to scale the persecution up with more efficient methods. And so an engraver in Nagasaki was commissioned to cast dozens of bronze plates from the melted down altars of demolished Catholic churches. These fumii still exist in museums and collections, and you can see the faces of Jesus and Mary worn down by the tens of thousands of feet. At the beginning of each month, Everyone suspected of being a Christian was called upon to trample on the fumie in the presence of the authorities. If they refused, they were tortured by various exotic methods. Some were scalded repeatedly in hot springs. Some were hung upside down in pits of human excrement. Some were beheaded, burned, crucified. Some experienced all of the above. If this sounds familiar, some of it is recounted in a famous novel by the Japanese Catholic writer Shusaku Endo, named Silence. Catholic colleges used to make it required reading, although I have no idea what they read these days. 2 years ago, the director Martin Scorsese made it into a film starring Liam Neeson. Now, I have a lot of thoughts about both the book and the film, and I'll share those in February when we return to Japan to hear the story behind St. Paul Mickey. Eventually, the people fought back, not only against the torture of Catholics, but for the loss of Catholic institutions, the hospitals and monasteries and schools and convents that provided so much for the needs of the poor. There was a people's revolt in 1637, the Shimabara Rebellion, but after some fierce skirmishes, the shogun's forces, aided by artillery from the Dutch, it was put down. When the rebellion was finally crushed, 4 remaining Catholic envoys from Macau were seized at Nagasaki, and after they refused to recant their Catholic faith, were put to death. The crushing of Catholic Christianity in Japan marked the beginning of the Edo period, a flourishing of the samurai culture. But as the samurai sun rose, it was setting on Christianity in Japan. It would not rise again for 250 years. The witness of Father Gutierrez and the other martyrs of Japan was like the last burst of sunlight before it drops below the horizon. The remaining Catholics went into hiding and became known as the Kukuri Kurishitan, literally the hidden Christians of Japan. In 1868, the Edo period came to an end, and foreigners were allowed to re-enter the country. Catholic missionaries returned and discovered that for 250 years the Kukuri Kurishitan had tried to preserve their Catholic faith. With the borders locked down and Bibles and Catholic books burned, their faith had become an oral tradition. They had no priests to administer the sacraments, so they had baptized their own children and taught them the prayers and hymns. They had preserved the liturgical calendar. They disguised elements of their faith, reciting Catholic prayers or singing hymns to Buddhist or Shinto melodies so as not to arouse the suspicion of their neighbors. They adapted their Catholic art and iconography to look like Buddhist or Shinto symbols. This is a statue of Mary and Jesus, given a Buddhist look to blend in. This is the crest of a Christian family. Notice the cross hidden in the design. In 1865, some of the hidden Christians around Nagasaki came to see the first new Catholic church in Japan, built by French missionaries. A French priest named Bernard Petitjean recorded that a Japanese Christian woman stepped forward to speak for the group. She told of how they had kept their Catholic faith over the centuries, and then she asked the priest 3 things. Was there a real statue of the Virgin Mary in the church that they could see with their own eyes? Was there a real priest, ordained and celibate? And had the priest really been sent to them by the Pope in Rome? Father Petitjean said yes. All of that is true. And then the Japanese brothers and sisters that had been hiding came forward in joy and entered the church in tears. 20 to 30,000 Catholics, less than 10% of the faithful when Nagasaki was the Rome of Japan, emerged from a 250-year shadow to receive the sacraments once again. Their story shocked the Catholic world. The French priest sent his description to Pope Pius IX, who called it a miracle and canonized many of the martyrs of Japan. The Catholic Church has always felt a special pain in its heart over the atomic bombing of Nagasaki because of the city's history and ground there made sacred by the witness of its martyrs. If you visit Nagasaki today, you can visit a park and a museum at ground zero of the atomic bombing. but Nagasaki has also become a remarkable Catholic pilgrimage destination. There are dozens of Catholic sites and shrines. Even the United Nations has designated them as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, called the Hidden Christian Sites in the Nagasaki region. You may have never heard this story that we've told tonight, this amazing tale about the flourishing of the church and then the hidden Christians in Japan. You know, in preparing for this episode, I checked one of the most popular textbooks on missions used in evangelical Protestant colleges and seminaries that I still have on my shelf. In 750 pages, it doesn't mention the story of the Japanese church one time. It only makes some passing reference that Jesuit missionaries in Asia produced no lasting spiritual benefits for the people over the centuries. Well, for many today, the hidden Christians of Japan are still hidden, but not after tonight. What does all of this have to say to us today? The Catholic Church in Japan is in decline once again, just like it is in the United States. But this time, it isn't the government demanding that we disavow our faith. Yet. No, we're losing it to consumerism, to postmodern values. But it's not out of the range of possibility that some 21st century version of a fumie test could be put before us, demanding us to prove that our faith is not the most important thing in our lives. If we ever find ourselves in that position, perhaps we can draw strength from the story of the Christians of Japan. The Vatican has carefully investigated the cases of the Japanese martyrs. The Japanese church kept meticulous records of the martyrs, including their Japanese and Christian names, the date and place of their martyrdom, and so forth. Over the last 200 years, the popes have beatified and canonized several different lists. There are the 26 martyrs of Nagasaki, the 205 martyrs of Japan, the Augustinian Recollects, and another group of 185 that were beatified in 2008 by Pope Benedict. All in all, nearly 400 Japanese martyrs have been beatified or canonized. But that doesn't include the hundreds or thousands of lay Catholics for which there were insufficient records. I'll close with the opening sentence from the official Catholic Encyclopedia's article about the Japanese martyrs. There is not, in the whole history of the Church, a single people who can offer to the admiration of the Christian world annals as glorious and a martyrology as lengthy as those of the people of Japan.
Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise, the glories of my God and King, the triumphs of His grace. The glories of my God and King, the triumphs of His grace. My gracious Master and my God, assist me to proclaim, to spread through all the earth abroad the honors of Thy name. To spread through all the earth abroad the honors of Thy name. Jesus, the name that charms our fears, that bids our sorrows cease. 'Tis music in the sinner's ears, 'tis life and health and peace. 'Tis music in the sinner's ears, 'tis life and health and peace. He breaks the power of canceled sin, He sets the prisoner free. His blood can make the foulest clean, His blood availed for me. His blood can make the foulest clean, His blood availed for me.
I wanted to open this series with the story behind Blessed Bartolome Gutierrez for two reasons. Because his feast day is September 3, 2 days from when this episode airs. And because I can't think of a better example of the one whirling adventure that is the Catholic story. I mean, just think about it. In Mexico City, just a few generations after the conversion of the Aztecs, a boy joins the Augustinian order and sails halfway around the world to the land of the rising sun, where he serves a suffering church founded by Jesuit missionaries from Portugal. He gives his life in heroic witness to Christ and inspires Japanese Catholics to keep their faith in secret for 250 years during the golden age of the samurai. It's breathtaking. And now you know the story behind the saint.